So you hear voices in your head. Are you crazy? You crazy person? You psycho lunatic person that should be shut up in a mental institution and put on pills? Lots of pills to numb your mind so that you don't hear the voices anymore. You need some pills! You need the government or the health insurance to pay for it and make lots and lots of money for the person that sells the pills. You need to be a zombie. You need to make zombies so that you don't question stuff. And especially you don't ever question why exactly do you have these voices in your head to begin with? Because here's the thing. If you actually look into that question, you might realize that it's not so weird. In fact, everybody, or just about everybody, also has voices in their head, and has since the beginning of all time. Have you ever noticed that cartoon? Have you ever seen that where you have the person that has a little angel on one shoulder and he's talking in the person's ear, and then the little devil on the other shoulder and he's talking in the person's ear, and the person is trying to figure out which one to listen to? Well, guess what? Like, we all relate to that. The reason that has become a meme in our culture is because we all relate to it. We all have the little angel on one side and the little devil on one side. What are those if not voices that are in your head? It's normal. It is normal to have voices in your head. What is pathological is when you don't know how to treat those voices and you don't know how to deal with them. Now, our society is in a very bad way because we have thrown out everything that is not scientifically explainable by the scientific mainstream establishment, which is extremely corrupt, by the way, which covers up a lot. You know, if the events of 2020 did not show you that, I don't know what to tell you. But clearly, science is corrupt, as is every institution of influence that exists in modern society. And why wouldn't it be? Right? Why wouldn't it be? Science is a modern day religion, and religion has always been corruptible. And there are a lot of religious people who don't want to hear about that, but that's the truth, because religion has influence. And so people who would like to have influence over you will weasel their way into a religious organization that you believe in, and will try to convince you of things that are in their interest and are not necessarily true and not necessarily in your interest. Well, guess what? The same thing is true of science. People weasel their way into the scientific establishment, and people fund the scientific establishment with a lot of money. In particular, I'm thinking of a guy whose name kind of sounds like Gil Bates. You ever heard of Gil Bates? Well, he puts millions, if not billions of dollars into funding scientific research, and more than scientific research is scientific propaganda. The media outlets that try to tell you what is real science and what is mainstream approved and what is the pseudoscience and the quack science that you're not supposed to believe in. You're supposed to ignore these people and you're supposed to ridicule them without ever bothering to look into what they're actually saying. And it's for this reason that this works for really, really well on people, by the way, because people are very afraid of ridicule. People are very afraid of being kicked out of the tribe. It's a natural instinct. It's okay that we have that instinct, but if we were to actually recognize it and recognize when it is being used to manipulate us, that might be somewhat helpful. And so most people, we believe the things that we believe because they appear to us to have the best evidence, or they appear to us to have the highest likelihood of being true. But for most people, that is not the case at all. Most people will cover their eyes and cover their ears and sing, la 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 la, I'm not listening, if you tell them something that is clearly true, but would be dangerous for them to acknowledge the truth of. And in fact, people will not even get to the point where they will even consider that it might possibly be true. because then they will have this inner conflict that, well, they can't believe this because this is dangerous. They can't believe something that's dangerous because then they might be ostracized, then they might be humiliated, then they might be kicked out of the tribe. So they can't believe the thing that's dangerous. But on the other hand, they're going to feel rather guilty if they know that the thing is true. They've researched it and they know that it's true, yet they reject it anyway. And so, if you try to convince them of something that is outside the mainstream and that they perceive as dangerous, they are going to see you as a threat to their well-being, and they do not want to listen to it. Because if they listen to it, they might just realize that it's correct. And if it's correct, then they have that conflict inside them that they're rejecting. Well, they either accept the correct thing and put themselves in physical danger, at least in their own minds, that's how they perceive it, or they reject the thing that they know is true, and then that eats away at their self-esteem. It hurts their ego, right? Because they know that they're cowards. And so it's easier for them to just refuse to even consider it in the first place. So, I'm getting way off on a tangent here. But the point is that we are very narrowly focused. The range of things that we will even consider as true is very small, and it is very easily manipulated by people who understand this point about human nature and have enough money and influence to be able to manipulate the propaganda machine, which decides what we are allowed to, like, what is the little range of things that we are allowed to believe without being humiliated and ostracized and being against the mainstream. So, in this case, with things of psychology in particular, we ignore the very fundamental fact that human beings are spiritual entities. We are spiritual entities that are currently inhabiting physical bodies. But the mainstream, tiny little horse blinder, allowable opinion is that the spiritual doesn't actually exist because it can't be measured with any kind of scientific instrument that we know of, which, by the way, is not necessarily true, because if there was a scientific instrument that could measure spirit, and I believe that's possible, by the way, I don't know if it's the case right now, but I believe that's possible. If that did exist, that would be suppressed. We would not be allowed to know about it unless there are ways to get around the system, right? There are things that people do not, that the powers that be do not want us to know about that we can learn about anyway, because there are a lot of us, and if we have enough will, we can get around the safeguards that they have put around their approved worldview, let's say. So, the problem with psychology is that we are spiritual beings, and our spirit is at the base of our psychology. In fact, the very word psychology, the word comes from the word psyche, and the word psyche literally means soul in Greek. So psychology really in its purest form is the study of the soul. However, it has been co-opted by people who do not even believe that the soul exists. They think that the soul is some religious fiction that was invented by people. Well, they say this. Now, whether they believe it or not, now we're opening another can of worms, and I'm not going to get into that right now. I suspect that a lot of these people do believe it, but they don't want, they want them to know it, but they don't want you to know it. And I have some good reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into that here. But the point is that they will not teach you about the spiritual aspect of psychology. And one of the most basic and what should be obvious and has been obvious for most of history manifestations of that spiritual nature of psychology is the angel on the one shoulder and the devil on the other shoulder. How is it that we have different voices speaking into our head that are not necessarily, that we don't even agree with, and many times? How often have you had a thought that just comes to you that's kind of shocking? You're like, That's nasty. I don't like that. And yet, we're told to believe that our own mind is generating that, or more specifically, our own brain, right? Because to the materialist types, to the tiny little bit of things that we're allowed to believe about science, the mind is just a phenomenon of the brain. The mind does not exist outside of the brain. It's just the brain neurons are firing in whatever biologically predetermined manner, and that's what creates the mind, rather than and that theory falls apart under the slightest scrutiny, by the way. If you ever ask yourself, how do you will something to happen? If I say that I want to raise my arm up in the air, what exactly was the impetus for me wanting to, or for me raising my arm up in the air? Well, the answer is it comes down to something called will. I willed it to happen. And so the will is something that you cannot boil down to a biological process. You can't boil it down to, a random neuron fired in the brain, and that gave you the will, and then you did it. Because it's clearly not random. Clearly, there is a pattern to this. If you listen to me talking right now, I am talking in coherent sentences. If it was just random neurons firing off in the brain, I would be making random movements and random noise that would have no coherence, that they would not work together. So clearly, to anybody who's thought about it for any length of time, the mind exists outside the brain. The mind pre-exists the brain and continues to exist after the brain is rotting in the ground. And anybody who has any kind of religion knows that, right? I mean, just think about it for half a second. You go to heaven or you go to hell, and you can feel things, you can notice things, you can observe things, you can think things, right? I mean, that's what every religion teaches. So clearly your mind is still working even when your brain is gone. You don't have a brain anymore, you don't have a body. A brain is matter. It's a fat thing in your head that rots away with your body. So you don't have a brain anymore, but you still have a mind. Well, there are people who do not have brains anymore, but they still have minds. And those people can communicate with you. If you ever wonder where do these voices come from, especially voices that say things that you reject, that you do not believe in at all. Well, clearly it's not you that's saying these things. Why would you? Or voices that are telling you to do terrible things to yourself, to hurt yourself. Well, you wouldn't do that, would you? No. These voices are coming from somewhere outside you. You have a communication from your brain or your mind. So if we're incarnate, our brain is mediating our mind. If we're in a human body, but there is some mind outside of ours that is communicating with our mind and putting ideas in our head. Now, everybody realized this until recently, and by the way, the extreme manifestation of this is called demon possession, which again, like every culture, is recognized for almost all of history until the last 50 years or something, where now we're all too big for our britches and we're like, oh, well, we don't believe in that silly stuff that those superstitious people 50 years ago believed in, which is really arrogant and stupid if you think about it. But demon possession is the most extreme manifestation of a phenomenon that happens every day. And I made a video about that, which will go to my channel. I think I just called it demon possession. In that we hear voices from spirits all the time. And you could make the argument that those spirits are human beings who have passed on, which I think is the case often. It might not always be the case, right? Because there's this whole spiritual universe that we can't see. If you look at just the range of frequencies that the human senses are able to attune to, even that mainstream science recognizes, the visual frequency is this tiny little sliver of the entire band of electromagnetic frequencies, and the hearing frequency is this tiny little band over here, and everything else in between is completely unmeasurable by our built-in instruments like our eyes and our ears and our smell and our senses. And much of it also is not measurable by the scientific equipment that we have, although that's gradually our equipment is becoming better and better, so we are able to sense a larger portion of that. But even sensing it is not enough. You have to be able to interpret it. So you notice that there's some frequency at this band of frequency, but you don't know what it means. You don't know if it's coming from you don't know where it's coming from. You don't know if it can be interpreted into a coherent signal or if it's just some random noise, which we don't even understand the concept of random very well. Random is just the term that we apply to a pattern that we do not recognize. Then it's random. But perhaps true randomness doesn't exist at all. If you ever try to create a random number generator, well, you realize it's a problem, because how do you define random? What do you tell the computer that is random? You don't. You find a pattern that is sufficiently unpredictable as to be indistinguishable to a current human mind from the abstract concept of randomness. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent again. So, you have voices in your head. That's not that abnormal, actually. Everybody has voices in their head, because we're spiritual beings, and we're surrounded by spiritual beings, many of which are invisible. And, some of those are probably humans who have passed on. Some of them may be some entirely other type of entity that we do not even realize exists yet. They could be angels, they could be aliens, who knows? They could be things that we don't even have a name for. I have no idea. They could be like little energy viruses that are just passing through the air. Could be thought forms. I believe that exists, that when you think something, it creates a spiritual entity, because a thought exists. We know that it exists. We can't see it or measure it or touch it. But we know that it exists, and we feel it when we have it. So where does that go? I mean, mainstream science says that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. It just changes form. So thought energy, where does that go? There must be some little cloud of spiritual energy floating around somewhere that is a thought. And so what happens to that? Does that affect other things in its vicinity? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect the answer is yes, but I don't know the answer to that. And I could tell you why I suspect that, but that's, again, I'm getting a little off track here. But there's all these spiritual entities around you that you, frankly, don't understand very well, and the propaganda system has made sure that you don't understand very well, and we don't study this, and the people that do say that we have this, they call us crazy. And they call you crazy for acknowledging that you have voices in your head. Well, they have voices in their heads too, but they don't call themselves crazy. They don't talk about it to other people. Now, that said, having voices in your head, for some people, can be a big problem. But it really is much less to do with the voices themselves than it is to the response to those voices in their head. If you've ever watched the movie It's a Beautiful Mind, it's a really excellent movie. It's about a guy who's a brilliant mathematician, who is John Nash, I believe is his name, who is a mathematician and created the concept of Nash equilibrium in economics, which I went to school for economics, so I remember learning about that. Well, this man, John Nash, he had some sort of entity that talked to him and would mislead him in various ways and tell him a bunch of things that weren't true. At least so we're told. I mean, again, like I don't know whether to believe. That's the mainstream story. I don't know whether it's true or not, but the mainstream story is that these entities that of course, according to them, were just invented by his own mind. Probably not in real life. They told him things like that the CIA was counting on him to do something and like put something in the mail. I don't remember the details, but they were telling him to do all this crazy stuff that was not benefiting him and was kind of driving him into insanity. And eventually what he learned to do was to just treat the entities, just kind of observe them, recognize their existence, but not really listen to them, not really care what it is they have to say. And so that's the way to deal with it. I mean, you have voices in your head. Some of them are helpful, some of them are not helpful. If you can figure out which ones are and which ones are not, if listening to voices in your head is making your life worse, then stop listening to them. And then probably, if you stop listening to them, eventually they'll stop trying. Chances are they're trying to make your life worse. Either they're low-order spirits that are trying to bother you, or they're trying to play with you. They're tricksters, or maybe they're enemies. They're people that hate you, or that people that hate someone close to you and want to harm you in order to harm them. There's a lot of reasons that spirits might be hostile to you, and so you can't just listen to them. And by the way, if you're curious, the Bible actually tells you how to distinguish. I believe the verse is 1 John 4:1, or it's in the chapter 1 John 4, which I'll leave it as a exercise to the viewer to go look that up yourself. But it tells you how to distinguish between spirits that are good and spirits that are bad, which is kind of interesting because mainstream Christianity, and again, there's that word mainstream that's influenced by the people that want to have power over what you believe. Mainstream Christianity does not recognize this, and mainstream Christianity would accuse this kind of thing of being witchcraft, and if it was a few hundred years ago, it might even burn you for talking about it. Interesting how those things work. But there it is, and bold face in the Bible. If you don't believe me, again, 1 John chapter 4, go read it for yourself. So figure out, I mean, the easiest solution is just to not listen to the voices in your head at all, right? That way you're not susceptible to any problems. You just recognize, and this is the key actually, is to recognize that the voices in your head are not you. They're not you. They're not your mind. They're not you. And I mean, sometimes they might be, but you just recognize that just because a voice is in your head does not mean it's you. It's not a chemical imbalance in your brain, which is the laziest explanation in the history of the world for a psychological phenomenon. Oh, it's a chemical imbalance in your brain. Right. You never stop to think that maybe if your chemicals in your brain are abnormal, maybe it's the voices in your head and the stress that it's causing you that are affecting your brain chemistry and not the other way around. Or perhaps it's a vicious cycle where the voices in your head, or the thoughts that you're thinking, and the thoughts that you are thinking in response to those voices in your head and the stress that causes your brain to secrete a certain mix of chemicals. And that mix of chemicals then affects your brain in another way. And, we can get into the science of neuroplasticity that shows that the mind can recreate the brain, which is, again, evidence that the mind pre-exists the brain, and the brain is not a mere phenomena of the mind. But anyway, if you can recognize that the voices in your head are not you, they may very well be coming outside of you, well, then you don't have to worry about it. And you can respond as if it was just some annoying person that was trying to bother you. Because it may very well be. That may be exactly what it is, an annoying person trying to bother you. And so if you don't listen to them, and if you don't put any importance on the things that they say, that doesn't have to affect you. And you have all the voices in your head you want, and you can still function perfectly normally and perfectly well in the world. It's when you accept that you're crazy, you accept that you are abnormal, and that your mind has problems, and that your brain is not producing the right chemicals. That's when you got a problem. But if you don't accept that, you just realize there's, chatter all around my mind by other entities, then you don't got to worry about it. Don't listen to them if you don't want to. Or if you want to be a little more discerning and realize that some of those entities may actually be helpful to you and may give you an advantage in life, then you can listen to the ones that are helpful to you and not listen to the ones that are unhelpful to you. And that takes a little bit of discernment, and you'll have to work on that a little bit to figure out which ones are your friends and which ones are not. But it's something that can absolutely be done. So if you have been in this situation and you've been worried about your own mental health, you've been worried about whether or not you are defective, you have some brain disease, if that's what you've thought about yourself because you hear voices in your head, I hope that this has been helpful. And I hope that your life improves drastically as a result. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.